Dzień dobry Państwu. Nazywam się Łukasz Modelski. Będę miał przyjemność zapośredniczyć dzisiejsze spotkanie z CAROLYN Steel.
Moderating and talking to CAROLYN Steel. She's the author of two big, relevant, important books talking about the history of food and the future of food, as well as the history and the future of civilization. One of her books, the latest one called Utopia, it will be published next year in Poland by the Zamek Publishing House in Polish, very soon. However, the other book, The Hungry City, was, well, it's made quite a lot of buzz, quite a lot of noise. The book was very much commented upon a decade ago. The book was all about how food, how grocery products, or habits around food and eating, and how all sorts of idiosyncrasies around food shape the world of cities, urban lives, and our civilization. So that book, The Hungry City, is very much part of this British tradition of thinking about food, about history, about sociology, about our civilization. So, as I said, quite a lot of noise created by that book. CAROLYN is an architect by background, by training. She traveled across a number of TED Talk conferences. She was a visiting lecturer at a number of universities. And her book, Utopia, that will be published next year in the Polish language, is something completely different. It's something very new. It's an attempt to not as much as to explain certain concepts that were presented in her first book, but it's more of a state of affairs of research as of now, as of today, 2020. So the current state of research about food, how we eat, what threats around that arise, what predictions may be drawn. And today we'll talk about those two books and CAROLYN's very novel ideas and concepts that she puts forward in her books. So, CAROLYN Steel, good afternoon.
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi there.
I can.
Okay, fine. We all know, because we travel to London. It happens pretty often here. We travel to London and we very often visit the Borough Market. It's a wonderful place for Instagram food. Many Polish foodies go there to try, to taste, to get closer to some organic food and so on and so on. So it's a monument. We know it very well. And what you say about Borough Market is Borough is a manifestation of our overwhelming disconnection with food in Britain, not the opposite. Why so harsh?
Gosh, I didn't realize I watched that harsh 12 years ago. How interesting. By the way, I should have said it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you so much for having me. Sorry, I kind of I missed my cue there, but it is wonderful to join you. I think, 12 years ago, or probably even longer ago when I was actually writing those words, it would have been probably about 2004, 2005. Actually, the state of our relationship with food in Britain was awful. And indeed, I would say it still is, believe it or not. So I think what we have in Britain is a very layered kind of food culture. And I mean, I often say that, if you study the roots of our problem with food, it goes back 250 years to the Industrial Revolution. The fact that we convulsively kind of literally drove people off the land into cities to work in factories. This was a more radical, more extreme more sudden transformation of our world than anything we've probably seen since until China in the 21st century, I would say. And food comes from the land. And so if you destroy your peasantry and you move people into cities and you make them dependent on industrial food, which very soon happened after that. So when the so I'm going to now give the whole history of the world and the answer to your first question, but that's the nature of food, everything's connected. You know, when food began to industrialize as well, which happened slightly afterwards, Britain immediately became the biggest importer in Europe of canned foods, for example, because it had to feed its urban populations. So I would just say that we have a longer history than any other country in the world of disassociation from food, disconnection with food, people living in cities having really no idea where their food comes from. And then overlaid on that, you know, probably from about, you know, the 1990s onwards, we've had this rediscovery, you could say foodieism, of food. And it's all about, oh yeah, as you say, it's now become Instagram, but it used to be kind of, you know, I could call it cooking porn, you know, kind of food programs where people are just sort of drooling over avocados and stuff. And this has created another layer on top, a sort of a pretty layer. And actually, I'm not saying that there hasn't been a genuine food renaissance in Britain. There has, you know, so it does go a lot deeper. But it's still, and I'm going to raise a very controversial issue now, it's very class-based in this country, food. So I think borough is a really interesting story. People don't, it used to be a wholesale market. It is no longer a wholesale market. It is a kind of glorified food court. The producers go there not to sell food because nobody buys food. They just take photographs. But it's good for them to be there because no, seriously. I mean, if you speak to the sellers there, they say, I don't sell anything from here, but it's very good for my business to have a sort of a stall here because I get seen, I get publicity, and then it supports my business. So it's actually not a market, partly because people in Britain, I mean, and, you know, again, some people buy food, obviously, and some people in Britain still cook. But you know, fewer people cook from scratch in this country, again, than anywhere else in Europe. So what you're mostly looking at is the kind of the appearance of a vibrant market that's actually an outdoors, tourist-driven food court.
Well, we are talking about the city itself. You are an architect, you are an author of books which touch the city, but isn't the real problem with food concerning rather countryside or rural landscapes or countryside depopulation, or at last the question of who owns the means of production or who owns land?
Yeah, again, I mean, this is why I love food as a lens for kind of looking at the world. And this is something that I always say, you know, about food, is that it connects everything, shapes everything. And it's very interesting, again, you know, if you ask me a question like this, I'm immediately wanting to talk about how civilization evolved, because it's really relevant. So if you think for most of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. And we were basically following the food around. You know, you basically picked the berries and the nuts off the trees, dug up the tubers in one area, you know, caught a few kind of buffalo or antelope, whatever it was, and then you moved on. You know, you followed the seasons around a landscape, and you might not come back to the same place for a year or so until it had had a chance to renew itself. When we started farming, all of that changed. I mean, it's quite interesting that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, says, you know, basically it's when we started planting seed and creating, you know, acres of smiling corn that the ruination of humanity began. Because, of course, if you're planting food in the ground and then you're watering it and you're protecting it and you're beating up animals off who might want to eat it, you are investing work in a place. Thing one, you live nearby, you know, you're not going to wander off and leave it, you know, so we start to get the beginning of settled encampments that then become cities over the course of many, many thousands of years. But secondly, you get the question of ownership, and I don't know where your questions are going to head, but I mean, so are you going to ask me explicitly about John Locke? Because if you're not, I'm going to talk about him now.
No, not really, not really. But
okay.
In your books, I think the real problem and the question you do not really ask is the question about the future land possession. Who is to have it?
Yeah. No, I think, well, so I do actually ask this in Cetopia, because I talk about basically, so just to say about John Locke, because it is interesting. So John Locke is 17th century English philosopher. He basically said, you know, the world was, you know, created for everyone. You know, so nobody has a right to say this bit of land is mine, but we need to eat. So how are we going to get over this problem? And he basically said, well, you know, if you pluck an apple off a tree and you eat it, then nobody can say that's not your apple because you've actually consumed it. And he then extends this idea to the idea of ownership and basically says, you know, everyone deserves to have, you know, possess enough land that they can feed themselves from it. So it's a kind of agrarian vision of an egalitarian society. And this gets taken up then in America. And it actually, I mean, the idea that liberty equals land ownership then gets bound up in the American Constitution because Jefferson read Locke and was blown away, you know, and he was also sort of very interested in farming. So you get a kind of agrarian-based idea of an egalitarian society. But then, as I discussed quite at some length in Cetopia, what happens is that the rhetoric stays the same, but instead of it being about land, it's about money. You know, and what the crucial thing that changes is that if people get rich, they buy more land. So Locke said very explicitly, it only works if people have only as much land as they need to feed themselves. As soon as they buy more land, the whole system falls apart. Of course, that's where we're at now. And then, I mean, when I was researching the new book, which I should probably show people actually, because I've got it here, and I will explain what Cetopia is. Oh, the camera's going the wrong way. I got very interested in the anarchists because, for example, Jean-Pierre Proudhon, writing in the 19th century, he basically says, it's all very well saying everyone deserves to have as much land as they need to feed themselves. But what if, you know, he uses the analogy, which is very, very apposite today. He says, what if there's a shipwreck and a whole bunch of people come ashore onto an island? What are the islanders going to do? They're going to say, well, you can't come ashore because we've used all the land up already. Of course you don't do that. Everyone just has a little bit less land. So Proudhon, I got fascinated by because he's a much more flexible thinker. He's actually saying we have to, you know, basically the amount of land that we all deserve to have is due down to how much we can afford to have. You know, and if you look at the kind of World Overshoot Day now and the fact that, you know, we've used up the world's resources in August the 22nd and the rest is kind of debt to the earth which can't sustain us. You know, I think these are much more interesting ideas. So I am kind of an anarchist in my approach to land. I actually think we all own it together. And it's more a question of not possession. This is the distinction that Proudhon makes. It's not possession of land, but it's basically renting land from the community. So this is where the idea of a land value tax comes in. And I think we have to move progressively towards these kinds of models of land ownership.
Locke's utopia is one of many utopias you discuss in Cetopia. So maybe we'll come back to utopias, but first let us try to explain what Cetopia is, because Cetopia is your title, is your notion. That's you actually who invented it, created it. Let's have a look on that.
Yes, okay. I was researching my first book, Hungry City, which you kindly mentioned in your introduction. And in the final, so basically in Hungry City, I was looking at how cities have been fed through history. I was basically asking the question, how do you feed a city? So I followed the journey of food, you know, from the land to the road, the market, the kitchen, the table, the waste dump, and then back to the land again. And in the final chapter, I wanted to kind of summarize basically, you know, what I'd been talking about. And by this point, it had been, you know, I'd had a revelation, basically, the extent to which food shapes our lives, you know, and I often say, you know, we're aware of how food shapes our bodies, because often we look down and, you know, irritatingly can't do up our trousers, speaking personally, but, you know, it also shapes our minds, our habits, our cities, our landscapes, our politics, our economics. I mean, I realised that food was this extraordinary force shaping the world. So in the final chapter, in each chapter of Hungry City, I had a kind of historical kind of survey of kind of how we got to where we are. So I thought, well, this is a sort of summarizing chapter, so why don't I research utopia? Because utopia is, you know, our greatest tradition about thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live. And I was reading about Thomas More's Utopia, and I came across an introduction that said, well, of course, utopia is a joke word. It can either mean a good place, from the Greek word EU, which is good, or OU, which means no. So it's an ideal place that can't exist. And I remember being very upset by this because I thought, well, you know, if our greatest tradition about thinking in a connected way about how we should live can't exist, we're kind of screwed. But then I thought, well, maybe I can invent a word that's an alternative. And this is how I came to invent the word Citopia. I'll just show you the book because it explains it on the front, if I can get it in front of the camera. Citopia means food place, from the Greek sitos for food and topos for place. And the great thing about this is that we actually already live in Citopia. We just live in a bad one because we expect food to be cheap. And I often say there is no such thing as cheap food. And the reason how you remember this is if you think about what food is for a minute, rather than just kind of mindlessly eating, you know, you think that food consists of living creatures that we nurture and then kill so we can live. You know, it's about the cycle of life, and food indeed is life. So if we cheapen food, we cheapen life. So the idea is that we have to move from a bad Citopia to a good Citopia by valuing food more. And that's the central premise of the book.
Well, sitos, as you are perfectly aware, means food, but it also means grain. And a funny thing, because in Polish we've got the word żyto, which means rye. So this in the Indo-European bunch of languages is very, very close to us. So we really can understand what Citopia may mean. But very often you use the term of good life, because Citopia also in your interpretation is looking for a good life, is seeking or quest for a good life. What is good life?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, Aristotle was the first person to kind of, as it were, directly ask this question in the West, and I'm not nearly as great a mind as he was. And he actually said, you know, basically, you know, a good life is going to be a different idea for every person. Everyone is going to have a different idea of what this is. But it does have something to do with flourishing for him. And for him, you know, the capacity to become a complete human, if you like. Now, Aristotle, you know, is a philosopher by trade. So it's all about thinking for him. It's all about developing the kind of the capacity to reason. And I agree with that. I mean, I think that is part of a good life, but I would probably have a less cerebral approach to that. I would say it's also, flourishing is also to do with becoming fully ourselves. But it's always critically, and this is another insight from Aristotle, it's critically within the context of society. And I love this term that Aristotle uses. He calls us political animals. And basically, this is a beautiful term because, you know, it means that, you know, we're political, which means that we always have to exist inside a society. But we're also animals, so it means we also need the natural world to flourish. So, again, this is rather abstract, but, you know, I would say in terms of food, for example, you know, a good life is clearly one in which everybody eats well, because eating well, I mean, is it's a complex thing. You know, in other words, I would say somebody shoving highly processed food down their throat while they're sitting on a train, while they're rushing somewhere, this is not eating well in almost every respect. Clearly, not having enough food to eat at all is not eating well. It almost goes without saying. Clearly, eating food that makes you sick, that makes the planet sick, that abuses animals or people is not eating well. But also to eat well, you not only have to eat good food, but you have to be comfortable, you have to be safe, you have to be, you know, in a non-precarious position. So it's many, many things coming together. But I think, you know, the idea of the capacity to flourish, you know, being safe, being, you know, sort of rewarded for doing something meaningful every day, being part of a functioning society, all of these things actually can be brought down to whether or not you're eating well. So I draw a very close distinction between eating and living well.
About flourishing, future urban growth is inevitable, yet the shape of it is not, you say. If our goal is to create a world in which everyone can flourish, and so on and so on. So isn't it a next utopia? Because the world where everyone can flourish did not exist, I guess, up till now. So how can you be so sure? What's the plan then?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I did deliberately invent a sort of practical, doable alternative to utopia. I realized that an ideal Sitopia is utopia. but the thing is, we already live in Sitopia. So actually, it does exist. And we can, through food, make so many things better. So yes, I mean, the goal would be for everybody to eat well. And as you acknowledge, that would be utopia. But I think we can get a lot closer because, you know, we can make real, everyday, you know, real life changes, both as individuals. I mean, weirdly, literally now, I am a program in the UK is being broadcast in which I am the Prime Minister of Sitopia, weirdly, which I haven't been able to listen to because I'm with you. But, you know, I had the great pleasure of imagining what a future world in which we really had put food back at the heart of society would be like. And as I say, I mean, it's just an ambition that we really live in what would inevitably be a much more equitable society. I mean, I talk a lot in the book about how we've gone from sharing through food, which we're very good at, and that's what our hunter-gatherer ancestors perfected. You know, I often say the shared meal is the first and the best economy. But we now, as I say, share through money, and we're really bad at that. You know, so I think we have to reinvest the value in food, which is the most valuable thing in our world. And I think that will take us a long way towards creating a better world. And yes, I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying the idea is very, very straightforward, and that's its great benefit because everything stems from it.
So let's try to be more concrete then. We are living in food revolution era. We deal with vertical farms, with urban farming, with urban beehives, with some major, vast change of consciousness concerning what we eat and how we eat, organic productions and so on. And you do it yourself, of course, also. But on the other hand, you say that that won't be enough. That will not feed the city. It's just a gesture somehow. It does not really substantially change the world. So, what are the steps to be taken?
Yes, I mean, I think weirdly, you can't feed a city from within itself. Absolutely right, and this is what I call the urban paradox. You know, the fact that we think of ourselves as urban, but actually our sustenance comes from elsewhere. So, in fact, you could say in a more profound sense, we still dwell in the countryside or in nature. But I would say that actually growing food in cities has a major benefit, and that is that it makes people reconnect with what food is. You know, and this is really, really important because I think part of the problem we have is that people living in cities get very, very disconnected from food. They don't even think about it anymore, and therefore they don't value it. And because most of us now live in cities, and because of the food, most of our food will always come from the countryside, it's really, really critical that we make the connection, you know, between city dwellers and country dwellers and farmers. And I'm arguing, as you know, for us to have more farmers, not fewer, because if we reinvest the true value of food in food, then more people will be able to afford to farm and look after the land, which all, you know, go towards the regenerative kind of farming that we need. So I think having, you know, funny vegetable patches sprouting in the middle of a city like London or Warsaw is actually really positive. I mean, I personally have started growing big Danish pickle cucumbers on my roof on the way up to my flat in London. This has changed my life because in March I have to start writing to my friends in Denmark saying, can you send me the seeds this year? And, you know, I've tried to save the seeds as well. You know, I have to get my compost, and, you know, I have to basically start living according to worldly time. And this changes everything. It changes your mindset. And really, it's our mindset that has to change.
By 2050, you say, the global food map is likely to have changed beyond recognition, with water stress, desertification, and failed harvests due to extreme weather, creating havoc for which few are prepared. If we add bees and insects holocaust, if we add birds mortality, if we add some problems connected strictly with ocean surface, do you still think it's feasible, it's doable? Because by 2050, it might look really, really tough. Aren't you too optimistic?
Is there such a thing as too optimistic? I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I agree with you that, you know, while writing the book and doing the research, it was quite difficult to maintain a kind of positive outlook. There's just so much huge, terrifying stuff out there that we have to deal with. For me, I mean, it's a kind of remaining, I wouldn't describe myself as optimistic. I would describe myself as someone who is determined to seek positive answers and positive ways forward, because I can't see any alternative if you give up. You know, if you just say, we're all screwed, whatever, let's just party, it's over anyway. But I'm just a kind of a bit of a sucker. I bit like, you know, I like the Stoic approach, maybe. But, you know, I often say what I'm doing is I'm constructing lifeboats. So we are on the Titanic. The iceberg is getting very close. We're going to hit it. I know this. You know this. Unfortunately, the captain of the ship doesn't seem to have quite realised this yet. I'm building lifeboats, and I'm building the best possible lifeboats I can build, because when we hit the iceberg, people are going to be running around looking for them, and Cetopia is going to be there waiting for them. The more we can do now, the more we can get the captain to steer the ship a bit to the left, the better, but we're still going to hit the iceberg. So, you know, I think it's happening. I mean, the beautiful thing about, you know, sort of William Gibson said the future's here already, it's just unevenly distributed, you know. I mean, I think what gives me hope is that Cetopia is already here. I spend my entire life meeting unbelievable people who are so inspiring, who are working to value food, you know, to sort of farm regeneratively, to feed people well. It's out there. We just need to kind of, you know, crank it up many gears. And I think weirdly COVID could help. You know, I think COVID has been a kind of wake-up call in many ways, and I think it is a chance to reset. We need to take it. It's as simple as that, really.
If we take a closer look on your diagnosis, you enumerate some sins of modern humanity. And this enumeration I find very, very interesting because it's not very obvious. For example, eating without being hungry. That's one of sins. Or creating food which is too delicious. Well, yeah, please come out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in the second chapter in the book, which is about the body, I write about the fact that, you know, through most of evolution, we adapted ourselves to our environment. You know, that, I mean, if you read your Darwin, you know, that is the definition of a successful species, is one that is ideally adapted to its environment. That is likely to succeed. What we've done over the last 250 years is we've stopped evolving ourselves and we've started evolving the environment instead, according to what we think we want. But it's a bit like getting a child to design its ideal sweet shop and then living in it. You know, basically, I believe very strongly that we need, you know, we need sour as well as sweet. We need friction as well as ease. You know, we're built to work. We're physically built to work. Our bodies need bitter foods. because basically that's where all the medicine is. But we're evolving food to only be sweet, and we expect to be happy all the time. And this is ridiculous. I mean, I find it very interesting as well that, for example, Aldous Huxley of Brave New World, he demanded the right to be unhappy, So I think we're not really very good at designing a world in which we can flourish, ironically. And now, funnily enough, nature is coming back at us, and it's giving us all the stuff we've tried to edit out. So it's coming back at us with stress. It's coming back at us with, flooding, with fire, with conditions that we actually have to react to, and we're not reacting to very well yet. But it's interesting that, it comes down to balance. And I think this is why, again, I find Aristotle so interesting as a thinker. Everything in his world is about finding a balance. And, I think we need a job revolution where we work more physically and with our hands, because actually our intelligence evolved through our hands, through the shaping of tools. So there's a strong connection between working with your hands and your head. I think we need more engagement outside the home. I mean, I know the British are fonder of lockdown than any other European nation, which I find really hilarious, because we also love ready meals and satellite TV, so we're ready-made. Nobody wants to leave the house in Britain. But also just more activity, more making, more actually making things, mending things, and certainly with food, much more diversity, much more engagement. I mean, it's very interesting, if you get kids growing food, they really love it, and they eat better, because it's no longer this thing that they're just that they're just being shoved down their throats, but actually that's something that they start to really care about and connect with. So, at almost every level, I would say we've over-evolved. The industrial project has overshot, and we're replacing ourselves with robots, and we've forgotten what it is to be human. I don't know whether you know the wonderful film Wall-E, where do you know that we're going in this direction? This is not a good life. So again, we need a recalibration.
From here is just a short leap to your observation about fasting eradication from our culture, and about how fasting is important. Why is it so important?
Well, I mean, this is really, really interesting. I mean, as you know, the research into the microbiome is very, very young. It's only really been going for about 15 years. And of course, we now have the technology to see what's really going on in our microbiome. And it's critical to our health. And what's really interesting is that if you fast, after about 12 hours, the body starts going into what's called repair mode. And that certain microbes in the gut that are really important to the way you digest, they stop kind of eating whatever it was you were eating, and they start actually nibbling away at your gut wall, the mucus that collects there. So they make a healthier gut wall. And, microbes like a bit of downtime, just like we do. I mean, you've got this kind of complex trillions of friends in your gut who are critical to your immune system, for example. And, I say in the book as well, eating, you never eat alone, because you're also feeding your microbes as well as you. And fasting is emerging as really critical to good health. I mean, I actually, when I can bear it, I fast for 16 hours a day. And it's part of trying to lose a bit of weight, because writing a book about food is an incredibly fattening activity. And I also love food. But it's good for you. It actually, there's very, very compelling evidence now that it's good for you. Of course, historically, our hunter-gatherer ancestors fasted because food wasn't constantly available, and then in our sort of urban history, there was kind of institutionalized fasting, to cover the hungry gaps in the year when basically there wasn't much food around, and it kept people happier, shall we say, if they felt they were fasting for a reason rather than just because their particular community was running out of food. So it's quite interesting how our history incorporated this thing that actually turns out to be really good for us.
What you underline and research is also a very narrow gap between skinny and obese.
Mm-hmm.
And it's your observation. I was not aware of such state of things. Could you comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a very famous line in Dickens, Mr. Micawber. He basically says, daily expenditure 20 shillings, daily income 19 shillings, misery. Daily income 20 shillings, daily expenditure 19 shillings, happiness. So the gap is indeed very small. It's not about splurging out on your birthday and eating chocolate cake. It's about what you do day in, day out. And it's also to do with the quality of the food you're eating. So again, this whole calorie thing's being busted out of the water. I mean, oh boy. I mean, there's so much rubbish that's written about food, and it's because the food industry has, a great amount of interest in getting us eating its products, because, this is basically its profit. And, very, very famously, there was a book written in the 1970s called Pure, White and Deadly, exposing how dangerous sugar was for us. And it was deliberately trashed in the United States by the sugar companies. They paid academics to write papers just demolishing this. And this is the beginning of our real modern obesity crisis. Fat was demonized, and sugar was crept in, often not called sugar, but called all sorts of other things, maltodextrin and whatever, sneaked in, these healthy, quote unquote, highly processed, low fat foods. And that's when the real obesity and diet-related disease crisis began. So, you really, thankfully, there are now people like Tim Spector in the UK, who's, the leading researcher on the microbiome, is actually bringing out these books basically saying, just ignore all that, just go for unprocessed, natural, balanced, diverse diets, more plants than meat, and you'll be fine. And that's what traditional food cultures always did, of course.
Conviviality. Why is it so important? Well, of course, we all know it is important. It's good for health to have other people by your table. But this aspect of living is so strongly underlined in your books. It looks much more important than we might think.
Yes. As you say, I think it's no accident that whenever we celebrate, we do it around food. We're absolutely hardwired to do this. Again, research is now emerging that shows that actually we react hormonally. Sort of a hormone called oxytocin, which makes us feel connected and loved, and all the rest of it gets stimulated when we eat the same food as other people. And touch is very important as well. And again, research is now emerging that says that, that there is no greater indicator of people who are likely to be unhappy or depressed than people who regularly eat on their own. So I think we're starting to discover that, as I say, we, as hunter-gatherers, we evolved through the shared meal at the end of the day. And that was the moment when everybody brought, the bounty of their day's work to the fire, and everybody sat around and told stories and shared food. And it's just so important to our sense of belonging, our sense of love, our sense of meaning, our sense of, being part of a community. And these are fundamental survival instincts. They're not add-ons. You cannot thrive as a human. This is why I love Aristotle's term political animal. Political. We have to be in society, and we have to be involved in what that society is doing. It's absolutely fundamental to our well-being and our health as well. We digest much better when we're eating with other people, because we're relaxed and we're happy and, we're up for it. And digestion's a complicated thing, and our mood absolutely affects our ability to absorb nutrients and all the rest of it. So it's all connected up. It's vital, it's central. And this is why, my core metaphor for a good society is one in which everyone eats well. Because, really everything does flow from it. And it's fun. And it's pleasure. It's my greatest pleasure.
Well, you say even more profoundly that rituals will save us, you say.
Yes, yeah. Well, it goes slightly back to what I was saying about the fact that I now grow plants on my roof. I have a little farm on my roof. Means that I am forced to live in cosmic time. And, I think we yearn to feel not only that we belong to a community, but also that we belong to a place, and that place ultimately, of course, is planet Earth. And I think historically, you know, the idea of home was very clear because we lived in a place and we sustained our life on that place, you know, so the connection was very direct. And I think now that most of us don't sustain our own lives directly, food is what can bring us back to that sense of locality. And, you know, so the fact that we eat every day, you know, and also that we're very good at sharing through food. I mean, food, the shared meal is the greatest ritual that we all still regularly take part in. And it's very, very interesting. I often say to people, you know, you don't sit down at a table laden with food with your friends or indeed with strangers and lean forward and go, "Oh, I'm going to have all of this for myself. Thank you very much." You know, we don't. Well, maybe you know people who do this, but with money, this is precisely what we do. So, you know, I think you know the shared meal not only links us to sort of you know how we belong in society, but also, as I say, to cosmic time, because the food has come from a real place. It grew seasonally somewhere, you know. I mean, you know, okay, yeah, you can force tomatoes in greenhouses and stuff, but I mean, it links us to a landscape, and the landscape belongs to a revolving planet. And we need to learn to live in time again. This is part of our sickness now. Again, I think this is something so interesting under lockdown. People have actually rediscovered the joy of living in time, which means taking time for the things that matter, like meals, which means spending time with their children. Hello, gosh, what a revelation. It's actually quite nice hanging out with your kids. The kids are happier. You know, I mean, it's just, so learning to live in time is part of recalibrating this idea of a good life for me. And I think nothing does it more powerfully than food.
How about local shops? Because very often in your both books, I find some remarks on local shops. They are to disappear totally. Sometimes some researchers said they would disappear in 2015. The others, they didn't. The others say it will happen in 2050. Don't you observe the opposite trend? That some local shops regrown or reestablished now?
Yeah, I mean, I do. And again, you know, COVID has been fascinating in this respect. Of course, the supermarkets, you know, who I think did react actually very well in many ways, but, you know, they did run out of famously loo paper. Oh, I don't know whether you had this also in Poland, but also in Britain. Hello, dried spaghetti and tinned tomatoes were the key foods that everybody ran out of. I mean, who knew we were Italian? You know, but it's because nobody can cook. I mean, you could go to the shop and there was plenty of fresh vegetables, you know. I mean, you could have eaten very, very well, but all people know how to cook is basically spag bol, what we call spag bol. So, you know, I think people did absolutely learn to value their local shops again. Local shops did incredibly well in this country. And I think they will always exist. And I think these things are cyclical. You know, so I often say COVID is like a forest fire. You know, if society is a forest, we're having a forest fire. You know, some things are getting destroyed, for sure. Other things are getting stronger. I mean, you know, the sort of the big chains are doing really well out of this. Amazon's doing really well. You know, that's threatening in many ways. But we still are human and we still want to be able to walk 100 yards out of our front door and buy a pint of milk or a loaf of bread. And these shops will come back and may come back in a different form. I actually believe, as well as hope, that the food movement, so the group of people who understand the true value of food, and I include a lot of young people in this, are going to want to eat differently. And, you know, again, under lockdown, people have discovered the joy of buying directly from producers. So I think we're going to see new models of food shop developing in cities. I mean, there's a whole crisis, of course, about what city centres are for now, because particularly in the UK, nobody wants to go back. So I think we're going to see a kind of a renewal, and I think absolutely small shops will be part of that. I don't think they're ever going to disappear, and I wouldn't want to live in a world in which they had disappeared, frankly. I mean, that would be, you know, a world where we just lost the plot for me.
I think it would be very hard to neglect globalization, and because the economy today is global, food is global. So if we strive to be local and to be self-sufficient and to stick to oikonomia, which is somehow self-sufficiency, the impact on the world, first of all, on so-called developing countries, would be enormous, would be huge. Probably no one can foresee it or count it somehow.
Yeah.
Aren't you afraid that first, it's impossible, second, if it's possible, it might be disastrous?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing for self-sufficiency or protectionism, actually. I'm arguing for a systemic shift. So, I mean, in the UK, for example, I mean, there was a Tory MP a few weeks ago quoted as saying, "We don't need farmers in the UK." I mean, this is insanity to me. But it's a mindset that we need to recover from. It's almost like a sickness. You know, for me, it's about every country producing naturally what they can produce. You know, so for me, it's equally insane for the UK to say we'll be self-sufficient. As you rightly say, we couldn't be anyway. I mean, you know, we haven't been self-sufficient since 1750 in this country. Secondly, it's equally insane for Kenyans to be growing green beans halfway up a mountaintop under artificial light so they can fly them to the UK, where they actually come from, you know, to replicate European conditions. Kenyans would be much better off growing their local food to feed their local populations. So it's a kind of, but I still want to drink coffee, thank you. So I still would like to import my coffee from Kenya. So, you know, I think it's moving to a much more flexible, systemic, global system with much more transparency. I think we need, you know, a total overhaul of global trade. And I mean, that's almost happening anyway because the WTO seems to have seized up entirely. We need basically a kind of a much more even playing field in terms of how we trade. Because historically, of course, Europe's dumped a lot of its excess goods on the rest of the world, which has also been damaging. But also just to say, you know, we're going to grow, you know, we're very good in the UK, for example, at rearing beef and lamb and growing amazing vegetables like cabbages and, you know, beans and whatever. Great. But then we're going to trade the rest. But of course, you can't grow our own bananas. I'm not going to condemn people in the UK to not eating bananas. But let's do a fair trade deal with the people who do grow bananas. And let's not have this fetishization of certain foods, like there's been an avocado fetish in the UK because Nigella Lawson scraped one very lasciviously and spread it on toast, and suddenly we've all gone mad. But I mean, this is causing terrible problems in, you know, Peru and Mexico, and, you know, where people, you know, become mafios because there's suddenly so much money to be made in it. So this is an unbalanced way of eating. So if we focus more, you know, towards what you know can be grown locally and seasonally, and base our main food around that, then we will have a much more stable global system. It's really, that's what I'm arguing for, but certainly not for a cease in all trade. I just want us to ground what we eat in place again and in time and in culture. That's not so hard.
Okay, how to fight the countryside depopulation then? Because well, you mentioned some shares of land and so on, but the fact is that countryside is still depopulating. People move to the cities. Cities keep growing. It's natural. It's natural everywhere right now. Well, natural. I mean, this is just the moment of history we live in. So, what would be your advice or your way to stop it?
Yes. Well, I mean, very, very interestingly, in the UK, there's a major debate going on about at the moment because people don't want to come into the cities. And actually, there's been a huge surge in people looking for properties in the countryside. So that's really interesting. And I need to keep an eye on that. I mean, before COVID, that was absolutely the case. And I write in the book about how the idea of progress and the idea of urbanization are literally kind of, you know, they're seen as one and the same thing, basically. And it's very interesting if you look at places like China, where that was absolutely the case 10, 15 years ago, they've now realized that they've got a problem because actually if you move everyone into the city and they've all got a job in a factory and so on, and suddenly, the bottom falls out of the clothing market or the whatever market it is, you suddenly got 20 million people unemployed living in a city where they're completely dependent on the state. So actually it's the relationship between the city and the countryside that's critical to civilization, because the countryside is productive. And actually it's very interesting, again, in COVID, when the lockdown happened in India, you had literally 47 million people who appeared to be city dwelling, but actually their real home was in the village, and they couldn't support themselves under lockdown and they had to go home, and many people died on the way. So I think we need to recalibrate the relationship between the city and the countryside. This is partly about investing in the countryside, actually. It's about, and this is why I'm still very interested in Ebenezer Hower's Garden City model. 100 years later, I still think it's got huge validity. And the internet is a game changer, because you can now live in the countryside and be in touch, and this is critical. So I think actually we are going to see a shift towards the countryside. Then the really important question is, how do we manage this? And what are people actually doing in the countryside? Are they just being lawyers, living in a pretty place? Or is that going to be part of a sort of a productive renaissance as well, where people actually grow food that's consumed locally, which I would argue for? So, I think, with vision, there's an amazing opportunity now to recalibrate this. But whatever we do, I think, we need, I use the term in the book, I talk about maximizing the urban-rural interface, because going back to this idea of us being political animals and us needing, to flourish, then we need society and we need nature. So to build a huge metropolis with no natural land in it and no production in it, to me, is a mistake. Just as to sort of, turn landscape, rural landscape into vast monocultures is also a mistake, because, again, I'm arguing we have to stop farming progressively. We have to stop farming with chemicals, because, as you mentioned, otherwise we're heading for a sixth mass extinction. We're heading for it anyway. So in order to do that, you need more people living in the countryside anyway, because if you farm differently, with more complexity, you need more people on the land doing it. So this is all part of what I imagine from my ideal shared meal. It all, it leads to a land revolution, and it leads to a different relationship between the city and the countryside.
In Zootopia, you underline that this movement from the city to the countryside is somehow fake or false, because people do not want to become farmers in the countryside. They go there to possess a nice house and live in some beautiful nature. So it doesn't count. I would say it doesn't count really, but
it can count as part of something, though. So basically, these rich people going to the countryside is really good. Yes, and not everybody wants to farm, and this is totally fine. But then they can provide a market for local people who do want to farm. Actually, a lot of people do want to farm, believe it or not. I meet people all the time who say they wish they could farm, but they can't get access to land, or they can't afford it because the profit margins are so low. So if we pay more for our food, you'll get more farmers. I guarantee this.
The profit margin, that's a good point. When I visit countryside in Poland, I see majority of farmers, landowners, not eating what they produce. They do their shopping in supermarkets which are nearby. So
Yes.
So it does not really change the system. The supermarket is already there. It's for them. It's much more convenient to go there.
Yes, and because we've gone down the road of incredibly commodified farming. One farmer will just grow beetroot and another one will just grow rye, and so of course they can't eat from their own farm. But I'm arguing that we move towards much more mixed farming, because I think we need to do this. If we're going to farm organically, which I believe we need to do, then we're at peak monoculture now, if you like, and we're going to actually go towards much more regenerative mixed farming, and your guys might actually start having a few chickens and cows on their farm again. It sounds like, oh, we're all going back to the medieval, but actually it's very, very progressive.
It depends on the margin.
So we have to pay more for food. This is it. I'm actually proposing that we internalize the true cost of food. So if you internalize the true cost, for example, of extremely polluting industrially produced meat, it's unaffordable. And we have to stop farming this way anyway. Meat has to go. I mean, I know this is a terrible thing to say to a Polish audience, and people are now going to throw rocks at my screen. But, we need to eat a lot less meat. But we can still eat meat, but much higher quality meat. So it's moving towards animals raised as part of a sort of regenerative farming program where they belong, but we can't produce in the quantities we're producing now.
You write about the share of our income which we spend on food and how it changes in time. As for today, I know it's hard to say, but as for today, which share of our income should we spend on food?
I would say something like 30%, 25, 30% would be about right. I mean, historically, that's what it was. I mean, housing is what's gone ludicrously expensive now. So we've just invented economies are inventions. They're human inventions. There are decisions about what we value and what we don't value. We happen to value housing. We happen not to value food at the moment, and we happen to choose to externalize the true cost of industrial food production. We could make different decisions. We could say housing is going to be really cheap, but you're going to spend more on your food. And then you're going to say, well, what about the bottom fifth of society who can't afford it, which is what everybody always says. And I say, well, how about we don't have a bottom fifth? Let's just have, different taxation, higher living wage, maybe UBI, universal basic income, and then everyone can afford to eat well. We need a more egalitarian society. We've got enough to go round. We actually do. But we need to shift away from this idea that a good life is just getting wealthier the whole time. It's a completely crazy, out of control idea. And a good life is about having somewhere lovely to live, maybe making stuff. It doesn't have to be growing your own food, but, sort of jobs with meaning, rather than just consume, hamster, hamster, hamster on its wheel, So it's just a different vision. That we can afford. We can afford to feed the world, and we can afford, or let me rephrase that because I actually hate that formulation. We have enough resources on the world if we share food and resources equitably for everybody to eat well and live well. So it's a distributional problem. It's not a production problem. And that's an interesting insight. And actually, the main population explosion, as you probably know, population is really interesting. As countries get wealthier and more stable, populations decline. So actually, it's mostly Africa who's going to be doing the growing, the population growing in the 21st century. And basically, that's because a lot of life in Africa is still very precarious. So they have lots of kids because they expect not all of them to survive. So that's where we need to be putting our efforts. But we can feed 7.5 billion people well, farming mostly organically, even with the technology that we now have. But it requires a revolution. It does require a revolution, and mostly in our minds.
Well, I've got two questions right now. Okay, let's start with education, because education is the topic which is not really present in Cetopia. You do not write about any educational projects, either concerning cooking lessons or less waste lessons or redistribution and so on. Do you have any ideas about this?
Yes, I do actually mention some educational programs. I know in Hungary City, I wrote the French program Semaine de Goût, where they basically teach kids over a week how to eat. And I'm very, very interested in education. In fact, I think I propose in Hungary City that we turn classrooms into kitchens, because I believe you can teach everything from a kitchen, especially with its doors onto a garden. So, I probably should write more about it. But yes, I think it's critical. And I think food and cooking needs to be put right back in the heart of the educational programme. Funnily enough, again on this in this programme on the BBC that's literally being broadcast live now, I invited Stephen Ritz, who works with kids in the Bronx. He does a lot of growing of food with kids in very, very deprived areas, and it's been completely transformative. I think good food in schools. So the Finnish school meals program, where they've again turned around literally the nation's health by having amazing school meals. I think it's absolutely vitally critical. And I'll take it on the chin that I should write more about it, but I certainly believe it's extremely important.
How about climate change, migrations? We are on the threshold of mass migrations in Europe. Within 30 years, probably the landscape will change totally. I'm thinking firstly about Mediterranean coasts in Spain, in Italy and France. That will definitely change the agrarian approach in those countries. We cannot really foresee how will it look like. Maybe this project or this change we are talking about right now is right now not relevant anymore.
I mean, I think, we have to change the way we produce food, and that means we have to change the way we eat. And there are certainly, I mean, basically the whole point about regenerative farming is that it's much more adaptable, than basically, the one size fits all, this is the crop I grow, these are the chemicals I use, sort of smash nature into submission. So, for example, I mean, I visited, when I was researching my book, I visited a so-called forest garden in Devon in the UK. And these are kind of completely different kinds of farms that mimic a forest, basically. And they're much more diverse. I think there's about 300 species on this fairly, not very big plot of land. And it's working with natural synergies within nature. So basically, some plants are about fixing nitrogen, some are about keeping pests down, some are about just literally keeping the soil healthy and so on. But what was really interesting about what the guy there, Martin Crawford, who set this up, said to me is he said it's really, really adaptable because the climate's changing all the time. And every year some plants do better than others. But because I've got so many plants, I can say, okay, well, that one's obviously not thriving so well here. Maybe it'll be possible to grow this, 100 miles north, but maybe I need to grow less of this now and more of these other plants. So he's all the time looking at the composition of what he's growing and saying what's working, what's not working. And of course, if we rewild, so rewilding is part of this kind of regenerative farming. You plant, have agroforestry, so you plant trees, alongside fields, and they provide windbreaks and they retain soil moisture, and you create sort of no-till is another really important idea where you basically don't plough land. So plants establish much deeper roots. They're much more able to withstand, harsh weather conditions like drought. And there's so many things we can do. I mean, I think we have to climb away from the mindset that, of farming just being a one-size-fits-all sort of silver bullet type thing. This is the crop I grow. This is what I eat. This is what I do. This is the chemicals I use. It requires much deeper thinking, more complexity, and much more working with nature. And if we do that, we will mitigate the worst of the, because it's primarily about climate change and, both withstanding the uneven weather patterns we've already created, but also making sure that they don't get worse.
I'm very eager to ask you about the National Fruit Reserve. It's a wonderful story, but first of all, maybe there are some questions from our audience, either here or from
Dziękuję bardzo. Łukasz, Carolyn, it's Colin McGivern here from the British Council. I just wanted to ask you about the affordability issue. I mean, you talk about the need for a revolution and for all of us to pay more for food. However, that aspiration is perhaps beyond the reach of many in low-paid work. So how do you manage that transition? What do we have to do?
Well, I mean, thank you. Very nice to meet you. Meet you, by the way, Colm. We've been tweeting a bit. No, I mean, I think it's a really, really important question. And of course, you know, I would not argue that we're going to make food more expensive, therefore people fall into food poverty. I mean, but I really want to turn this on its head. You know, I already, before I started writing about food, was very, very disturbed by how neoliberalism was leading to more and more inequality. And it's no accident that the two leading neoliberal nations, you know, in the West, you know, America and in Europe, the UK, have the most unequal societies, because we've basically let the market decide who earns what. And as we know, I mean, as Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz and, you know, many, many great economic minds have pointed out, if you just let capitalism run kind of unchecked, you get a tiny, you know, the 0.1% who basically just do nothing but fly from one super yacht to the next, and everybody else tends towards poverty. You know, we've lost our middle classes because the manufacturing base of work is disappearing. You know, with basically the capitalist model of economics and society is dead. It was very 20th century. It's over. We need a new economy. And, you know, I think, you know, it's very interesting, again, with COVID, you know, the government has had no chance but to step in and put, you know, 9 million people on furlough or something. I mean, the government can act if it chooses to. And people are now sort of saying, well, this is this is a reason to go towards UBI. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, you know, I'm going to sound like a Marxist now, but I mean, you know, the ideal cost of labour in a capitalist society is zero. You know, so what does this say about working people? You know, so we have to value humans. And I think, you know, part of the problem that sorry, this is, you got me on one of my sort of favourite rant topics. But, you know, I mean, we've reached a point where basically we're still kind of pedaling the bicycle, but we've actually gone over the cliff. You know, we need a totally different vision of wealth. This is why I'm actually proposing we reinvest wealth in something that is real, which is food. We absolutely raise the bottom. You know, we tax differently. We have a wealth redistribution moment, as Thomas Piketty is advising, and that's global, by the way. And, you know, we in order for people to be happy with this, we need to redistribute land as well. And this also clearly needs to be done progressively, because you will have riots and pitchforks if you basically march onto people's land and say we're having this, which is why I think the land value tax model is incredibly interesting. It has to be progressive, but basically, you know, and we have to basically arrive at a much more equal society with food as its centre. And yes, it requires action in every sphere: political, economic, international, and local. But that is what I'm arguing for, is what I think we need. And food just happens to sit in the centre, because if you, as I say, have the ambition of everybody eating well, and then you just let that radiate out to the rest of society, it's actually all there. So yes, I guess it's inherently quite a revolutionary approach, but it can be done incrementally. It doesn't have to scare the horses. You can start with the low-hanging stuff, just like, you know, raise the minimum wage and make sure it's actually enforced, for example, and tax differently, and increase inheritance tax, etc. Does that answer your question? You look a bit worried.
Well,
well, you've got a mask on, so you might be smiling with your mouth.
Another question.
Hello. I'm not quite sure if that would be the question, but I have two ideas. When you were talking about this Cytopia which exists, which is already here, so I was thinking about dualism of this Cytopia, which means for me that on the global north, we can say that Cytopia means we have too much food, generally, of course, and in global south, we have not enough food.
Yeah.
So I was quite surprised that for this more than 1 hour discussion, we didn't mention even once the word hunger. So
yes.
Also with the second idea, which is quite close to this one, is for education, that because I work for an NGO which works with sustainable education, so I think one way also to teach about how we can change this food world is also to talk about the real causes of hunger. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, and thank you very much for that. I mean, I think I did briefly mention hunger about 50 minutes ago, but yes, you're right, we haven't talked about it nearly enough. I mean, clearly, there's a massive food issue and, you know, distribution issue, I would say, because actually globally, we do produce enough food for everybody to eat. It's just it's not reaching the right people. And of course, people in the developing world or the global south, as you say, often they're very, very food insecure, and there's about a billion. Well, it varies between 800,000 and a billion people who don't have enough to eat. I mean, the irony is that, and often they're in places which are most severely affected by the climate shifts that we're seeing because of the way we're living. So there's a deep inequality and injustice there, a global injustice, I would say. And secondly, often part of the problem is that people have also stopped growing local crops, and they've started growing, you know, commodified crops to feed the West with. And actually, therefore, they go from being the farmers who feed themselves to being consumers on the global market. And then, you know, if food prices spike as they did in 2008, for example, they can't afford to buy food. So, I mean, there's many, many aspects of this. And also, I briefly mentioned food dumping from the West as well onto the global South, which also sort of has the effect of basically taking the bottom out of the market there. So it's a hugely complex problem. Absolutely, my vision is for everyone in the world to eat well, not just the West, obviously. And I did talk a lot about, you know, more transparent global trade, which I think is critical to this. And if you like, a new sort of global social contract, I think, which is where everybody gets to eat well, means that actually we have to sort of do a readjustment, a bit along the line, if you've heard Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, for example, of where, you know, we consume less in the north so that people in the south can consume more. And this, I do write about all of these kinds of things in my book, and I'm sorry that the conversation hasn't really gone that way. And you said something about education, but I can't remember what now. What was it? Sorry?
Yeah, I said that I think one of the way to teach how we can change this food world is to maybe talk about real causes of hunger in schools. Or
real causes of hunger, yes. Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
the causes, what I mean is like to say clearly that people are starving because we are eating too much. And what I was saying before, it's not to say that you avoid that, how the hunger can be, how we can change the world, that people won't be hungry, but I just didn't hear the word hunger, and maybe now I have the question. So should we use the word hunger to talk about how to change the food world, or should we avoid it? Because it's just about the word. I heard you ways that you were talking a lot about the ways how to change it, but it was only about the word.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting word. I mean, my first book, as you know, is called Hungry City. And I called it that because in English, the word hunger has this kind of double meaning. So hungry means, you know, you need to eat, but it also means kind of rapacious. It means greedy. It could almost mean greedy city. And, you know, I think, and so I wrote a lot about the fact that those of us in the industrialized world living in cities, you know, we consume unthinkingly, and we don't realize that, you know, our lives have, you know, deep effects on parts of the world that we don't see. And I do argue that food is, you know, I call it an emissary from another world, you know. So I think the idea of hunger, yes, it's the word itself. I mean, starving is a even stronger word, you know. And I mean, people talk about living in hunger, which is obviously it's certainly not a good life. Starving, yeah, almost implies, you know, basically a crisis moment. And I suppose, you know, hunger would be the appropriate word. But I think it's part of the package of things that we tend to ignore in our everyday conversation. And well, thank you for bringing it up to date, because it's hugely important. And I certainly don't ignore it in my thinking, because everything I'm saying really is about redistributing wealth and justice, global justice. So I appreciate you highlighting that. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here. Thank you, CAROLYN STEEL. Your book, Cetopia, will be published next year in Polish by wydawnictwo Zamek. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And, you know, I hope we can build a better world through food together.
Thanks a lot. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo.
Very much.